The first time it happened, it was so subtle, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. The warm brush of his fingers against mine, the split second where our hands lingered too long in the passing of a dish across the dinner table. A moment so fleeting, it should have meant nothing, yet it sent a strange rush through me. A flicker of something I had no business feeling. I pulled my hand back quickly, swallowing hard as I looked at the man sitting across from me. My husband, James, was too engrossed in his phone to notice anything. He had mastered the art of tuning out the world, a skill he perfected over the years. The only sounds in the room were the clinking of utensils and the hum of the refrigerator. But my pulse was drumming in my ears, drowning out everything else. I looked over at Nathan, my stepson. His blue eyes met mine, unreadable, calculating. He was polite, well-mannered, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that had always intrigued me. He was nothing like the awkward boy I met years ago when James and I got married. At 23, Nathan had grown into the kind of man who drew attention effortlessly. Tall, lean, but strong, with sharp features that hinted at trouble. I shouldn't have noticed these things. I shouldn't have let my mind wander down roads that had no place in reality. But I was restless, unsatisfied, and it had been years since James made me feel like I was something other than a fixture in his life. I was a wife in title, a companion out of habit, but nothing more. And Nathan had a way of making me feel seen in a way that unnerved me. After dinner, I busied myself with washing dishes, trying to shake off the lingering awareness of him. But then, just as I was reaching for a plate, his hand covered mine. The sudden contact sent a jolt up my arm, and I gasped before I could stop myself. "Careful," he murmured. "That one's slippery." His voice was low, almost amused. I turned my head slightly, and for the briefest moment, we were too close. His breath was warm against my cheek, and I caught the faint scent of his cologne, something crisp and intoxicating. I jerked my hand away, gripping the edge of the sink to steady myself. "I've got it," I said too quickly. He didn't move immediately, lingering for a second longer than necessary before stepping back. My skin tingled where he had touched me, and I hated the way my stomach fluttered. I was being ridiculous. He was just being helpful. I was reading too much into things. That night, lying in bed beside James, I stared at the ceiling, my mind refusing to settle. I told myself it was nothing, that it would pass. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to shift back. The next morning, I tried to push everything aside and act normal. James was leaving for a business trip, and I played the role of the dutiful wife, packing his suitcase, kissing his cheek, pretending I cared when he reminded me to water the plants while he was gone. Nathan, however, was another story. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed as he watched James say his goodbyes. When our eyes met, something unspoken passed between us. It was a warning, a challenge, an acknowledgement of something we both knew but weren't ready to voice. I spent the first few hours after James left trying to keep busy. But by the afternoon, the house felt too big, too empty. I was pouring myself a glass of wine when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Nathan standing there, watching me in that same unreadable way. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if that was the truth. Just needed a moment. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "You seem different," I swallowed. "Different how?" He tilted his head slightly, considering. "Like you're waiting for something to happen." I exhaled a soft laugh, shaking my head. "You're imagining things. Maybe." He didn't sound convinced, and neither was I. The tension between us was thick, undeniable. I told myself it was dangerous, foolish, something that could never be acted upon. But the longer we stood there, the more I wondered if I was lying to myself. because the truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted to resist. The days after James left were a slow-burning test of control, a dangerous game of restraint. I wasn't sure I wanted to win. The house felt different with just the two of us. It wasn't just the absence of James. It was the way the silence between Nathan and me carried a weight, a promise neither of us dared to speak aloud. I spent the first day doing everything I could to keep my hands busy, scrubbing countertops that weren't dirty, reorganizing cabinets, even flipping through old magazines I had no interest in reading. But every so often, I would catch a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye, lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone, stretching in that way that made the hem of his shirt ride up just enough to tease at the muscles underneath. I would force my gaze away, scolding myself for looking, for noticing. By the third day, I had given up pretending. There was no escaping the energy that crackled between us, no denying the way my breath caught when he walked too close. Every moment alone with him felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible, and I was starting to question why I was still holding back. That evening, I was in the kitchen, pouring myself another glass of wine, my second, or was it my third, when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around, but I knew it was him. I could feel it in the way the air in the room shifted, in the way my fingers trembled just slightly as I lifted the glass to my lips. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice casual, but there was an undertone to it, something that sent a ripple down my spine. I took a slow sip, trying to steady myself, just keeping busy. Nathan stepped closer, and I could feel his presence behind me. "You sure that's all it is?" I set the glass down, exhaling a shaky breath before finally turning to face him. He was too close, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, they were locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "What else would it be?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied me, as if deciding whether to push further. And then, without warning, he reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. It was such a small gesture, so innocent in theory, but the way his fingers lingered, the way my body reacted to his touch, it wasn't innocent at all. I should have stepped back. I should have ended this before it went any further. But I didn't move. I stayed right where I was, heart hammering, breath shallow, as his hand slowly dropped away. "This isn't a good idea," I whispered, more to myself than to him. Nathan tilted his head slightly, a slow, knowing smile playing at his lips. "Then why aren't you walking away?" I had no answer to that, and I hated how much I didn't want to find one. The tension between us grew thicker with each passing hour. It was in the way his eyes lingered when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he found excuses to be close, the way my body reacted to his nearness, despite every voice in my head telling me to stop. The night before James was due to return, I sat in the living room with another glass of wine, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows around the room. Nathan walked in, his hair damp from a shower, wearing only a pair of sweatpants that hung low on his hips. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down on the couch across from me, watching me in that way that made my breath catch. "You've been avoiding me," he said after a long silence. I let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I don't think that's true." "It is." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Why?" I swirled the wine in my glass, watching the way the liquid caught the light. "Because I don't trust myself around you." There, I had said it. The words hung between us, heavy and dangerous, and I braced myself for his reaction. But Nathan didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked like he had been waiting for me to admit it. He stood up slowly, crossing the room until he was standing right in front of me. "Then maybe," he murmured, his voice low, "you should stop fighting it." My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. Every muscle in my body was taut, caught between the urge to run and the urge to lean in. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat was dry, and all I could do was stare up at him, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment, jolting me back to reality. I sucked in a breath, my head spinning as I scrambled to stand up. Nathan took a slow step back, his expression unreadable, but I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't over. I turned toward the door, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the handle. When I pulled it open, my stomach dropped. James stood on the doorstep, his suitcase beside him, looking exhausted but pleased to be home early. "Surprise," he said with a smile. "I caught an earlier flight." I forced a smile, my heart still racing for an entirely different reason now. That's great." His eyes flickered past me, landing on Nathan, who was still standing in the middle of the living room. Something in James' expression shifted, just slightly, but I caught it. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of what had almost happened hung thick in the air, invisible but undeniable. I felt it. Nathan felt it. And I had a feeling that James, whether he realized it yet or not, felt it too. James's early return shifted everything. The moment he walked through that door, the weight of my actions, or nearly actions, crashed down on me. I felt exposed, as though James could see right through me, as though my every thought, every unspoken impulse, was written across my face. I forced a smile, hugging him, feeling the awkwardness of my own touch. He didn't seem to notice. Nathan stood still, his face unreadable, but I could feel his gaze. He was watching me, waiting for some kind of reaction, some sign that what had happened between us, or nearly happened, wasn't just in his head. I avoided his eyes. I couldn't afford to look at him. Not now. James stretched, rolling his shoulders. Flight was exhausting, but at least I'm home. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Figured I'd surprise you." "You did," I murmured. My voice sounded too high, too breathy, but James didn't seem to catch it. He turned toward Nathan and clapped him on the back. "Hope she didn't drive you crazy while I was gone," Nathan smirked, his expression unreadable. "She was great company." I felt my breath hitch, but I kept my face neutral. James just laughed, completely unaware of the tension that simmered beneath the surface. He grabbed his suitcase and started up the stairs. "Gonna take a shower. Maybe we can order something in tonight? I don't have the energy to cook." "Sounds perfect," I said, my voice steady, even though my hands were gripping the back of a chair for support. James disappeared upstairs, leaving Nathan and me alone. The silence between us was suffocating. I could feel the heat of his presence, even without looking at him, but I refused to meet his gaze. "You gonna pretend like that didn't just happen?" His voice was quiet but firm. I closed my eyes for a second before finally turning to face him. "It didn't happen." Nathan's lips curled into a slow smile, one that sent a dangerous shiver down my spine. "Keep telling yourself that." I inhaled sharply, turning away. I needed distance. I needed space. I needed to remember who I was, what was at stake. I was not this person. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't foolish. I had a husband who, despite his flaws, trusted me. I wouldn't cross that line. That night at dinner, I played my role perfectly. I laughed at James's stories, nodded in all the right places, reached for his hand across the table, pretending like my world hadn't been shaken just hours before. Nathan was quieter than usual, but I knew why. He was watching me, waiting for cracks to show. James was exhausted, so he went to bed early. I stayed downstairs, cleaning up, prolonging the inevitable. But when I finally turned around, Nathan was there, leaning against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Stop," I whispered before he could say anything. "I haven't said a word." "You don't have to." He stepped closer, and I felt my resolve slipping. "You don't really want to stop," I exhaled shakily. "Nathan, I know you think this is wrong, and maybe it is, but you felt it. I know you did." His voice was low, filled with something dangerous, something thrilling. And I don't think you want to fight it as much as you say you do. I shook my head, willing myself to walk away, but I didn't move. Nathan's gaze darkened slightly, and I knew he understood exactly what that meant. The next few days were torture. James was home, oblivious, and I was constantly on edge. Every time I walked past Nathan, I felt the heat of his presence. Every time he looked at me, I felt that same pulse of anticipation, of dread, of something I couldn't name but knew I shouldn't want. One afternoon, James had gone out to run errands, and I was alone in the kitchen when Nathan walked in. I tensed, pretending to be engrossed in chopping vegetables, but I could feel him watching me. "This is getting exhausting," he said, stepping closer. I swallowed, forcing myself to keep my hand steady. "I don't know what you mean." Nathan let out a soft laugh. "You do." I turned to face him, arms crossed over my chest. "This is dangerous." He tilted his head slightly. "Is it? Or is it just inevitable?" My breath caught. "Nathan, you need to stop." He took another step forward, closing the distance between us. "Tell me you don't want this, and I'll stop." I opened my mouth, ready to say it, to end this once and for all, but the words wouldn't come. His gaze searched mine, waiting. And then slowly, he reached out, his fingers barely grazing my arm. It was such a small touch, barely there, but it sent a spark through me that I couldn't ignore. I was about to step back, about to break whatever spell had settled over us, when the sound of the front door opening sent us both reeling apart. My heart pounded as James called out from the hallway, "Honey, I'm back!" Nathan took a slow step away, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that told me this wasn't over. And I knew, deep down, that he was right. I had convinced myself I could regain control, that I could force things back to the way they were. But the moment I heard James's voice in the hallway that day, saw Nathan step away with that knowing look in his eyes, I knew I had already lost the battle. There was no undoing what had begun. James walked into the kitchen, setting a bag of groceries on the counter. "I picked up a few things. Thought we could grill out tonight." I nodded quickly, my voice tight. "Sounds great." Nathan lingered near the kitchen door, watching me. He wasn't smiling, wasn't teasing. He was waiting, reading me in a way I wasn't sure I wanted to be read. I turned away, busying myself with unpacking the groceries, my hands shaking slightly as I placed items into the fridge. "Nathan, mind grabbing the charcoal from the garage?" James asked casually, oblivious to the way tension hung thick in the air. Nathan hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." I let out a slow breath the moment he was gone. My pulse was still erratic, my skin still warm from the way he had looked at me just moments before. I kept my head down, pretending to focus on the task in front of me. James stepped behind me, pressing a quick kiss to my temple. "You okay? You seem distracted." I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "Just tired. It's been a long week." He squeezed my shoulder gently. "I know, but I'm home now. Things can get back to normal." Normal. The word felt so foreign, so unattainable now. That night we grilled outside, the air thick with the scent of smoke and seared meat. James was relaxed, chatting away about work, cracking jokes. I smiled and nodded in all the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. Nathan sat across from me, his expression unreadable. He barely spoke, but I could feel him watching me. When dinner was over, James stretched and yawned. "I think I'm going to turn in early. Long day." I nodded, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. "I'll be up in a bit." James kissed my cheek before disappearing inside, leaving me and Nathan alone under the dim glow of the patio lights. The silence between us was thick, charged. I should have gotten up and gone inside. I should have ended this before it could go any further. But I didn't. Nathan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "So, are we still pretending this isn't happening?" I swallowed, gripping the edge of the table. "Nathan, you can lie to yourself all you want. he interrupted, his voice low, steady. But you can't lie to me. I shook my head, looking away. This is wrong. Maybe, he admitted. But that doesn't mean you don't want it. My breath caught. We can't. He stood slowly, stepping around the table until he was standing beside me. He didn't touch me, but I could feel his presence, the heat of him so close. Then tell me to walk away. Tell me you don't feel this, and I will. I opened my mouth, but the words refused to come. I wanted to say them. I needed to, but I didn't. Nathan let the silence stretch between us before nodding slightly. That's what I thought. He turned and walked inside, leaving me there alone with my own thoughts, my own desires, my own guilt. The following days were torture. James was home, but I felt more disconnected from him than ever. I moved through the motions of daily life, pretending everything was fine, pretending I wasn't unraveling inside. Nathan didn't push me, didn't try to force anything, but the tension between us was undeniable. Every glance, every accidental touch, every moment we were alone, it was all too much. One afternoon, James had a meeting across town, and I was in the kitchen when Nathan walked in. I froze as he approached, stopping just inches away from me. How long are we going to keep doing this? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. I gripped the counter behind me. Doing what? Pretending, fighting it. I shook my head. This is wrong. Then why are you still standing here? I had no answer. I was trapped, torn between what I knew was right and what I wanted. Nathan reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm, and I shivered at the contact. Tell me to stop, he murmured. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. And then, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. I jumped back, my heart hammering in my chest. Nathan didn't move, didn't look away from me. This isn't over, he said before turning and walking away. And I knew, deep down, that he was right. The days blurred together in a haze of guilt, desire, and tension so thick, I felt like I was suffocating. James carried on as if nothing had changed, because for him, nothing had. He had no idea that every time he kissed me, every time he touched me, my mind was somewhere else, on someone else. Nathan had stopped pushing, but that didn't mean he had let it go. The way he looked at me, the way he lingered just a little too close, it was all still there. A reminder that the line between us had already been crossed, even if we hadn't spoken it aloud. One evening, James had an event to attend, some work function that required him to dress up, shake hands, and talk business over cocktails. He kissed my cheek before he left, promising he wouldn't be too late. I nodded, plastering on a smile, knowing full well my heart was hammering for an entirely different reason. Nathan was in the living room when I turned back around, sitting on the couch, his eyes locked on me. I hesitated, my pulse racing. We shouldn't be alone together, I said, though I didn't move. Nathan's lips twitched, amusement flickering across his face. Then why aren't you leaving? I swallowed hard, knowing I had no answer that wouldn't be a lie. He stood, slow and deliberate, closing the space between us in a way that made my breath catch. I could smell his cologne, could feel the warmth radiating off him. I'm done pretending, he murmured. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to step back, to do the right thing. But when I opened them, his face was inches from mine, his eyes dark, filled with something dangerous and electric. You don't have to fight this, he said. I inhaled sharply. I should, but you don't want to. The words hung between us, thick with meaning. I could still walk away. I could still fix this before it went too far. But I knew, in that moment, that I wouldn't. I reached for him before I could stop myself, my fingers gripping the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. His hands landed on my waist, firm, possessive, and I felt my body melt into his before our lips even met. It was reckless, it was wrong, but it was inevitable. Hours later, as I lay tangled in sheets, that were no longer just mine, reality crashed down on me. My breath was still uneven, my body still humming from what had happened, but the weight of it settled into my chest like a stone. Nathan was propped up on one elbow, watching me with that same unreadable expression. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "No regrets," he murmured. I let out a slow breath. "That's a lie." He didn't argue. He knew as well as I did that what we had done could never be taken back. I sat up, wrapping the sheet around me as guilt clawed at my insides. James, my husband, the man who trusted me, who loved me, who had no idea that his wife had just betrayed him in the worst possible way. Nathan sat up too, his fingers tracing slow circles against my back. "You're thinking too much." I turned to look at him. "How can I not?" His jaw tightened. "Because you wanted this, just like I did. That doesn't make it right." He let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Nothing about this was ever right." A car door slammed outside, and my stomach dropped. James was home. Panic set in instantly. I scrambled off the bed, grabbing at my clothes, my hands trembling as I fumbled to pull them on. Nathan didn't move as quickly. He just sat there, watching me, calm despite the chaos that had just erupted in my head. "You need to go," I whispered harshly. He smirked. "That's not very convincing." "Nathan, please," he sighed, pushing off the bed, reaching for his jeans. "Relax, he's not going to know." But I wasn't sure. I barely managed to smooth my hair and pull my robe tightly around me before I heard the front door open. Nathan disappeared into the hallway just as James's footsteps echoed toward the bedroom. I forced myself to breathe, to act normal, to pretend I wasn't falling apart inside. James stepped into the room, his tie loosened, exhaustion clear on his face. "Hey," he said, setting his keys down on the dresser. "You're still up?" I nodded quickly. "Yeah, couldn't sleep." He walked over, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "Missed you tonight." I swallowed hard, my skin burning where Nathan's hands had been just hours before. "Missed you too." James smiled, oblivious, before heading into the bathroom. The moment the door closed behind him, I let out a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the dresser to steady myself. This was a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake. And yet, deep down, I knew it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.